Welcome to the State Historical Society of Iowa's Iowa Stories Lecture. My name is Mary Bennett. Our presentation will last approximately 45 or 50 minutes, followed by questions and answers, and will be recorded for later viewing on our website. During the talk, we encourage you to submit any questions via the chat box. Today, we have the privilege of learning what life was like in Iowa 800 years ago. Household economy at Wall Ridge, a 14th-century Central Plains farmstead in the Missouri Valley, tells the story of a Native American household that occupied a lodge on the Eastern Plains during the early 1300s AD. Contributors use cutting-edge methods and the site's unparalleled archaeological record to shed light on the daily technical, subsistence, and dietary aspects of the occupants' lives. As this discussion will demonstrate, Indigenous peoples were the traditional stewards of this land in prehistoric and historic times. We recognize and respect the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional territories. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory you reside on, and as a way of honoring Indigenous peoples who've been living and working on this land from time immemorial. This is a collaborative investigation that involved a variety of participants over the course of several decades. And although they cannot join us today, we'd like to salute the co-authors of this book, Steve Lenzik and Shirley Schemmer. There were technicians in the lab, there were people getting their feet muddy, there were people putting up with rainstorms, all to gather this evidence for us. I hold these four gentlemen in the highest esteem for their expert detective work and their careful scientific analysis to uncover, document, and interpret this story of Iowa's ancient past. Today, we have with us Michael J. Perry, who's a research associate at the Office of the State Archaeologist, University of Iowa. We have Jim Theler, who's professor emeritus at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse from 1984 to 2010, and a senior research associate 2010 to present at the Mississippi Valley Archaeological Center at the UW-La Crosse campus. Bill Green is former state archaeologist of Iowa from 1988 to 2001, and retired director of the Logan Museum of Anthropology at Beloit College from 2001 to 2018. Joseph Tiffany is a professor emeritus and former executive director of the Mississippi Valley Archaeology Center on the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse campus. Tiffany also worked at the Office of the State Archaeologist at the University of Iowa for many years, serving as associate director. And in his retirement, these gentlemen are joining us today to tell us this fascinating story. Join me in welcoming them.
Hello, everyone. My name is Joe Tiffany, and we're going to talk about the Wall Ridge Site project, which began in 1983, as Mike will tell you, because he was the one that found the site. And a mere 36 years later, we finally got a report out on this, in large part because of lack of funding. The first thing I wanted to show you was what the site area looked like then, which you can see on the right there. Kind of a sloping, almost bench-like feature overlooking the Missouri Valley. That, if you look in the back, that's I-29 running up there. On the left, this gives you an idea of the site and the general resources that were available based on the landforms. So you have these high, narrow, steep ridges that comprise the Loess Hills. Below that, hill slopes, and I guess it's a green. This kind of flesh-colored material is colluvial sediments that have washed down over the years from the bluffs. And this soil is tillable by the technology that the Native Americans had out there with, and what's interesting about this catchment is all these sites have about the same amount of tillable soil. They may be on the Missouri Valley Wall, they may be along Pony Creek, they may be high, they may be low, but they wanted access to tillable soil. The hill slopes provide timber, potable water, so you have everything you need if you're a scout. All you got to do is build your house and camp. This is the distribution of the Central Plains tradition. You can see this little bump out here is where we're at, the Glenwood phase. We're in a group of sites called the Nebraska variant. These clusters, Smoky Hill, Solomon, Upper Republican, are all basically producing the same data. Uh, these sites have been known, or some of them as early as the turn of the last century or before. They all are represented little hamlets and farmsteads, just like Wall Ridge. All are unfortified. These people didn't really have internal enemies amongst themselves. Where they came from, probably eastern Oklahoma. Um, Archaeologists segregate out these various clusters based on their geographic distribution, but also, although they have the same general technology and pottery types in particular, the frequencies of the kinds of pottery types they use vary. So out here it's more collared, over here is more a straight rim, but to make a short story long, that's what the Central Plains tradition is about. Mike, tell us about the distribution in the Glenwood locality.
Hi, Mike Perry. Um, well, what you see here is the plot of the locations of all the known lodges, Glenwood locality, and you can see that they're all pretty much in the hills to the east of the Missouri River floodplain. They tend to be scattered up and down the Keg Creek and Pony Creek valleys. There's a few more kind of to the north, a little closer to the Missouri River valley, but they're all in that more rugged topography. Very few located on flat ground out in the Missouri bottoms. That's the distribution that we know about. There are probably twice as many houses as you see. Haven't been able to find yet, but somebody estimated at one time probably over 500 lodges in this little area that you see here, and it's about 3 miles wide, 9 miles long, north and south.
You might mention there's a lot of houses there, but there's very few people. These houses weren't occupied very long, so a remarkably small number of people could have produced all the houses over the course of the entire occupation. So you look at this map and go, wow, there's millions out there. No, there's just a few hundred at best. So how do we date this? It's radiocarbon assay. Uh, there are, I think, close to 100 dates from the Central Plains tradition that were uh, measured by radiocarbon dating using weighted means and averages for each of the sites where you had 5 or more dates. Here's the radiocarbon calibration timeline. And where it flattens out here means there's a lot of carbon in the atmosphere and you really can't tell where it dates. So we're down here and you can see there's quite a spread of radiocarbon dates, but there's mainly a cluster of them right here in dark blue that date from AD 1200 to 1350. And you get down here to Wall Ridge and it's even a narrower focus between AD 1297 and 1306. So it's a very tightly dated site. Uh, all this, of course, could change in the next time someone runs a series of radiocarbon dates, but this is where we made the basis for when the site was occupied. So it's pretty late in prehistory. Our our farming folks were up here around 1300 AD. This was found on a highway, a secondary road project. The site actually laid in a borrow pit for a local road that was being rebuilt. Mike went out in the standard archaeological techniques of using a basically shovel and then a post hole auger to punch down holes in the surface and see what was there. He hit pottery, hit artifacts, and hit a feature and said, you know, I think there's something here. So a report was written up. The DOT, Iowa Department of Transportation, agreed, and a secondary work was done. At that point, the site was declared eligible by the State Historic Preservation Officer for the National Register of Historic Places. Then the problem starts. The site dropped out of federal funding, so we had very few resources available to us financially to actually excavate this site. A $3,000 grant and a couple of others. So everybody out here, when we were all fully employed as opposed to now, volunteered. To your left here are uh, uh, people who are participating in Iowa Archaeological Society Field School. This is one of the co-editors, Shirley Shermer, who's looking at something. I don't know what she's looking at. So anyway, this thing was a real difficult project on one level to excavate it with so little time and so little money, but to try and do it right. And I think we did. Okay, Mike, tell about the house.
What you see here is the plan view of the features that were recognized on the floor of the house. The black dots indicate post holes, locations of support posts for the structure of the house, and then the kind of grayish hatched areas are storage pits that were used at one time or another. Not all of them, of course, were open at the same time, but they would use one, fill it with a year or so of crop supplies, and then empty it out and then start filling it in with refuse and dig another pit for the next season's stored crops. So there are storage and refuse pits that you see scattered about the floor of the lodge. And then the excavation areas are outlined there on the left half. What's to the right of the excavation area was exposed machinery. They brought in after they hand dug all of the squares that you see on the left, they brought in a bulldozer and stripped away all of the topsoil down to where the lodge floor, and then they were able to define the rest of these features and posts that you see on the right. That's our interpretation of or that's what we're given to try and interpret the shape of the lodge. We used those features then to try and figure out storage pit volume and capacity, and from that go to one means of estimating the duration of occupation at the lodge.
The central addition houses have 4 central support posts. 3 of them are shown here on this one. The 4th one wasn't found. If you follow the posts around the outside, the shape of this thing is kind of a D-shaped. Normally these houses are squarish or rectangular, a few are circular, but this one there are a few that are shaped like this, but it's not I don't want to say traditional, it's not a form that was used very often. But the data we're going to talk about, especially the environmental data, which is the flora and the fauna that give us all the information about how they adapted and used the resources, are coming from these storage pits.
It's fair to say that the size of the lodge, it's about 25 feet in diameter, is that right?
Yeah, it ends up with a surface area of about, 100 square meters or less. So we'll talk about later on, how archaeologists take this, like Mike said, these various lines of data and come up with estimates for how long the site was, how long people lived here, basically, and what they were doing. So anybody else want to comment? I'll go to the next slide if not. Bill can talk about these. These are the central support posts. And you can see that 2 of them very clearly are charred on the bottom.
Right. Now that doesn't necessarily indicate that the house as a whole burned.
Correct.
What it probably indicates is that the base of these support posts was treated so that it would inhibit rotting. So there's some charring of the posts. But these were fairly substantial posts. They were elm, which was the preferred structural timber in the Glenwood locality for the 150, 200 years that people were building these lodges scattered all over the region. So yeah, elm.
I should mention to folks who may not be familiar with all the technology, there's no steel axes. There's no horses. Their main draft animal are dogs, and themselves carrying stuff around. To put up one of these lodges, you had to use a stone axe, and that is not easy. It can be done, but these bigger timbers would have to be girded, bark stripped off of them, chewed down basically with a stone celt, and then set into position. So things that we might take for granted is actually hard work. And for a lodge, as we'll see, that doesn't have a very long use life, it's amazing the amount of time that energy they put into building one of these things. So,
One reason, well, we'll get to it later probably, but we find relatively little wood, even in the lodges that burned, because
correct.
they tried to reuse as much wood as possible, take it from one lodge to the next one as they were setting up a new homestead.
And if you had to chew one of these things down with the tools they had, you'd understand why they picked up the superstructure, moved it on if they could. This is a image of kind of a typical Glenwood phase ceramic vessels of the kind found at Wall Ridge. There are very few of these colored jars. Those are the ones that are more common in western Nebraska. What there's a abundance of it, Wall Ridge, are these low flared rimmed vessels with handles on them, bowls, bottles, seed jars, and these kind of narrow necked vessels are called water bottles. Whether they're used for that purpose or not, it's hard to say, but very few, not much variety in the pottery. It's all utilitarian, but nonetheless, the frequencies among these help us to order the sites chronologically based on the frequency of pottery, not only within the Glenwood locality itself, but as I mentioned, across the whole Central Plains area where these people lived and worked. Pipes. Who wants to talk about the pipes? Several ceramic pipes. Yes, they were smokers. Yes, they had tobacco. This pipe in particular, you can see there's a hand here, and there's a stylized face over here. This kind of decoration is found on other Central Plains house sites, and it ties them back to basically their roots in eastern Oklahoma. So even though they moved out and are hundreds of miles from where they started out, they're continuing some belief systems that they had before.
I'm not going to show you pictures of arrowheads or scrapers, things like that. They're pretty common here at Wall Ridge, but you've seen them before. What I will want to talk about, though, is the kinds of raw materials that those artifacts were produced from. Now, I should say, first of all, the stone tools, most of the stone tools were analyzed probably almost 30 years ago by Toby Morrow, who's probably the recognized expert in Iowa at the time, and for quite a number of years, in lithic technology, prehistoric lithic technology. And but unfortunately, Toby couldn't be with us anymore. He passed away a few years ago. We're missing him. I'm sure he would have plenty to say about what's going on here with the stone tools. My involvement with the lithic analysis at Wall Ridge was mostly with the flaking debris, the waste material generated by the production of all the stone tools that Toby analyzed. Between the two of us, though, what we did was try to identify the raw materials that all the waste material and the tools themselves produced from. And this slide represents the locations that we've been able to determine. Of course, we couldn't identify everything, and there were some things that Toby and I didn't agree about, but we pulled together this particular slide, which shows locations of samples that we have in our OSA comparative chert collection that we used to identify the material that we found from the excavation at Wall Ridge. The samples in the comparative collection come from known locations that we've plotted on maps, and they're probably modern exposures for the most part, not necessarily locations that would have been exploited prehistorically, but probably certainly within the vicinity of locations that were actually prehistorically exploited. And so we can be reasonably certain that these locations are probably in the neighborhood of where the actual materials were found, that the tools and waste material were produced from. So what you see in the inset in the lower left is an enlarged area that you see in the southwestern part of Iowa in the larger part of the image. There's a tiny red dot in the inset indicating the location of the Wellridge site and some of the more nearby outcroppings that we know about. Probably 2/3 of the sample of all the lithic chipped stone material came from 1 or 2 sources within about 2, 3, 4 miles maybe of the site. We call that material the spring branch chert. Probably 2/3 of the material at the site was all this spring branch material, and that makes sense. It's the closest location we know about to the house itself. And why go farther if you've got perfectly good raw material relatively close? There's a few others a little farther outlying down the Curzon, the Plattsmouth, Stoner Chert, Sheldon over in Nebraska, and South Bend over on the Nebraska side of the river. Those would be a little bit farther, certainly accessible within about a day's walk. Now, one thing though you will notice is that there's other, I should say that probably all of those specimens of these relatively close lying outcrop sources were probably going to make up about 90% between of all the artifacts that were found. The rest of it is coming from these outlying locations that you see in the larger part of the image. Going all the way up to North Dakota, the Knife River Flint. There's another source in South Dakota, the Ogallala Ortho Quartzite. And going on down the Missouri River, some Winterset, Jefferson City, Burlington Chert. These are all, we have artifacts made from all of those materials. And what it indicates is that, well, number one, the Missouri River is probably the main corridor for transportation of lithic raw materials in prehistory. Now, were people at Glenwood actually going to those locations that you see? Maybe not, but certainly there's hand-to-hand exchange working its way up and down the river over time. That corridor, the Missouri River corridor, stands out here pretty clearly as the route that was taking. Now you'll notice a couple of sources in Kansas. It's kind of eastern Kansas Florence material. That comes from the Flint Hills region of eastern Kansas, and for a long time it was called Flint Hills Chert. It was eventually renamed Florence. That's also making its way into Glenwood, and that's probably associated with some of these Central Plains tradition people outside the Glenwood area. So what we can say is our Glenwood folks are interacting with quite a few different people up and down the Missouri River and off into Kansas. I think that's interesting. This kind of analysis has been going on for some years, not really all that new, but with GIS, I've developed this map with GIS. We've been able to enhance our interpretive abilities with respect to those kinds of activities. So that's what I wanted to talk about with the stone tools. Back to you, Joe.
We'll look briefly at some of the bone and shell tools. Jim Theler did the animal identification, and then he and I both examined them for probable use. There's, like everything else, there's a general range of stuff that we don't have time to show you all the awls, punches, and other things that are recovered from the site. In particular, scapula hose, and Bill mentioned people moving on and taking things with them. These Glenwood Lodge sites produce on an average of about 3 bison scapula hose, which are the main blade for their hose for farming. What we have at Wall Ridge is a good example. It's all broken, exhausted hoe and knife fragments. So they're taking, if there was more, they took it with them. Anyway, these things you can recognize, fish hooks. And next to it, one day Jim came down and said, "Look at this." Tell them what that is, Jim.
Well, these are freshwater mussel shells, and the pointy part on the top is called the beak of the mussel. And there was a dark or red or brown substance adhering to these shells. And on closer examination, we found this on a number of valves, a number of shells. And this appears to be pigment of some type. They worked very hard to try to get it off with toothbrushes in the lab. They failed to do so. And this residue we found on quite a number of shells, and we think they were using these to apply pigment to hides of some kind to color it. So ochre, charcoal mix is what we think. And it was kind of an interesting find. Once you look for it, you start seeing it on these shells. And I hadn't seen this before. I've done quite a number of freshwater mussels, and so this was a new thing.
Yeah, this is first reported of shell applicators, not only in the plains, but almost anywhere. One of Jim's students did her senior thesis,
Yes.
did an experimental project, got a deer hide, made some pigment and goo, and used that applicator, and it worked, right?
Yes.
Yes, it has produced the artifact. And just to the left is another very uncommon find. It's a fish gorge, which is a little sliver of bone sharpened at both ends, and you can see where it's blowing up that there's a notch to tie the string to. You dangle that in the water and catch yourself a fish. So there's some interesting artifacts coming out of this. Next slide, please. That's on the cover. Bone fish lures. These are also found in eastern Nebraska. This, I just like this personally. How do you make a bone fish hook? Well, you take a piece of scrap bone, you drill 2 holes, you cut through lines, groove it around the inside, snap it, and you got yourself 2 fish hooks. Pretty slick. How long do you suppose that took, Jim?
A few hours, but you got to have lots of time in the winter. So cold, dark nights.
Yes. So there's quite a range of stuff coming out of the site that you don't normally see in any particular site. Next slide, please.
You'd probably be carving those fish hooks as you're sitting, as you're ice fishing with the lure. With the
I'll let Mike talk about this. This summarizes the
Density distributions.
density distributions. Go ahead, Mike.
What you see here are, well, we took the floor plan of the house and it's the excavation area, the hand excavation units on the left. And we summed up all of the artifacts by their excavation levels and compared the distribution vertically through each of the excavation units. And we were able to determine from that basically there are 2 strata that comprise the deposits that bury the floor of the lodge. Sort of an overburden deposit in the upper about 50 or 60 centimeters, maybe 2 feet total in depth is the overburden. And below that is what we call the lodge fill. basically soils rich in artifacts filling the lodge basin above the floor of the house. And we took the areas, well, the volumes of each of those deposits within each excavation unit and calculated the density of each, well, of the ceramics and the chipstone artifacts and the other lithic artifacts, the ground stone and the burnt rock and the introduced rock, to make each of 3 plots of the density of artifacts in both the overburden and in the lodge fill on the right. We were trying to decide if there's any way to tell from these density plots where there might be activity areas on the floor of the house, or if there's something tells us something about the way the house floor was being used, either during the occupation or perhaps afterward. In the overburden, you will see that artifacts tend to spill outside of the house, and that's what you would expect from soils that accumulated up above the lodge fill and post-occupational disturbances are moving those artifacts and spreading them around over and beyond the lodge fill. And so you see artifacts getting outside the lodge basin, some of them fairly common on the kind of the southwest side of the house. When you get down into the lodge fill, you'll notice that there are no artifacts outside. There are no artifacts outside the house basin. Everything that was recovered was within the house basin itself, basically. And you can see that pretty plainly in both ceramics and the lithic artifacts. All of them are inside the lodge, in the lodge fill deposit. Now, what can we tell from these plots? This, I should say, has only recently been attempted at maybe 1 or 2 other Central Plains sites. This is the first of the Glenwood sites that we've tried this on. I would say that it leaves a bit to be desired because we don't have controlled excavation units over the entire lodge floor. Ideally, that would be the case, but we just didn't get that. So for half the lodge or more, we don't really have any data available to work with. And then some of the excavation units weren't excavated in a manner that allowed us to do this sort of analysis. And so some of them we couldn't use. But what you can see with the higher density artifact counts occurring there in that kind of the southwest part of the house, that's probably a lot of refuse activity going on there. And that may be either, we can't tell, is it related to activity in the house at the time of occupation, or is it related to refuse disposal after the house was abandoned? We can't really tell for sure. Now you'll notice also over in the overburden, a number of the rocks that are in the lower left part of the slide, you'll see high density appearing in the north part of the house in the overburden. And we suspect there somebody had piled up some rocks probably on the outside of the house, maybe up on top of the house. And when the lodge fill, or when the lodge collapsed after it was abandoned, those rocks ended up in the overburden deposit. And that's kind of an unusual situation there. But there you have the our attempt at density plotting in the first Glenwood house that we've tried it at.
Now for the fun data. Next slide.
All right. Well, when I started working at the OSA in Iowa, I was thinking, what does the rest of the world know about Iowa? And if the rest of the world knows anything about Iowa, it's corn and agriculture in general. Um, so if you look at the eastern U.S. as a center for ancient agriculture, as you see on this map, are you thinking about corn, beans, and squash? Well, you might be, but those actually originated south in Mesoamerica. Corn and beans did. Squash might have been local origin. So when we think about ancient agriculture and in the context of this site in particular, let's go to the next slide. Of course, we do have the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. They work very well together as agricultural crops that sustained native people for 1,000 years or so in North America, most of North America. And when we were looking at the plant remains excavated from the Wall Ridge site, very carefully extracted through a water flotation process, we, of course, identified corn, beans, and squash. Beans had just come into the area in the 1200s, probably. So it was a very, very efficient agricultural system. But Eastern North America and really the Central Plains also was the hub of other types of domesticated plants. So let's look at the next slide. And you'll see one very familiar to all of us, sunflower. This is a native North American domesticated crop, probably originated in the Missouri River Valley area. And as of about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, had already become a staple to some degree throughout Eastern North America. And of course, sunflower seeds were very prevalent at Wall Ridge. But next slide will show you a plant. What is this? The seeds of this plant were the most abundant seeds that we found in the samples from Wall Ridge. And next slide will answer the question. This is a plant called little barley. It's the same genus as the barley that we eat today, Hordeum. But it's a native North American plant. It likes relatively dry and often disturbed areas. Unfortunately, as you see on the right, the seed is in the wild populations is enclosed in a very tough bract. It's almost impossible to get out. But native people, through their agricultural ingenuity, developed a domesticated variety of little barley with a naked grain, just like Old World barley. So it's very easy to thresh and to process and to consume. Next slide will show you how we actually identify these. We use the microscope. These are relatively small, maybe 3 millimeters in size. And next slide shows that we even use the scanning electron microscope. This is as of 1980s vintage. The microscopes are much sleeker now. But the next slide shows the scanning electron microscope allows us to take a very, very close look at these seeds. On the left is one from Wall Ridge. On the right is a modern specimen. You'll see that the ancient ones were larger. They were domesticated, naked grains. And this occurs not only with little barley, but with some of the half dozen other native plants that were domesticated and used at the site as a supplement to the corn, beans, and squash in a very, very diverse and, for that time, sustainable agricultural system. So we had little barley, we had extinct varieties of plants called sumpweed and knotweed and goosefoot. We just think of these as weeds now, but these produce very nutritious grains. And the inhabitants of Wall Ridge and many other sites in Western Iowa utilize these domesticated plants as supplements to the three sisters, corn, beans, and squash. Let's move on to the animals, Jim.
Okay, next slide, please. Well, I view animal remains, shells, and bones as really as proxies for things in the past. Habitats that were exploited in local environment, regional climate, subsistence are all keyed in. We can start with very small gastropods on the right. That's a penny, and those are little gastropods called Gastrocopter procera. Write that down. Winged snaggletooth, and those are very sensitive to climate. They don't occur in any place where the climate has less than 160 frost-free days. We've demonstrated that pretty clearly, and these are shifts over time. So having these at Wall Ridge gives us a sense for what the frost-free period would have been important for agriculture. The big guy on the left, we find shells of this two-banded forest snail, tells us something about the local environment, probably not a subsistence item per se, but certainly a part of the environment and the wooded, moist floodplain along the Missouri River. Next slide, please. Many things show up. A fine quality of extraction through flotation, as Bill mentioned, water screening. We get lots of crayfish or crawdad remains. These are pinchers from one species of crawfish, a paper shell that occurred at the site. We can do a minimum number of individuals on these. So we had some 700 specimens, but only about 34 individuals represented at the site. So people are out seining crawfish. If you've been to New Orleans, you know they're good. Next slide, please. Turtles are sometimes used. This is on the upper left as a part of a snapping turtle shell. It's charred, and it was certainly captured. The modern shell on the right is from about a 20-pound specimen. These are easily captured during their egg-laying activities when the females come up on shore. During about the 1st of June, you can go up and grab one. That's illegal here, but you can do it in prehistory and toss it in the fire and have it for dinner. Snapping turtles are very good to eat also. There's a little baby at the bottom. Next slide, please. Fish are abundant at the site, about 13,600 plus bones that I spent several years sorting and looking at. At the top, that is a centimeter scale. That's 2 centimeters. The black is 1 centimeter long. So these are very small catfish like the ones you see below. These are almost entirely black bullheads, occur in the floodplain of Missouri River and quieter backwater areas, tolerant of kind of a muddy environment. And we had over 200 bullheads represented at the site and several hundred bones. Fish are abundant. They're taking all kinds of fish. Some are in clear water like largemouth bass, others in the more turbid water such as gar, bullheads, and buffalo fish. So there's a great variety of fish, more than 400 individual fish represented at Wall Ridge. So fishing is an important activity down on the floodplain. Next slide, please. This is from our friend, the flathead catfish or mud catfish. It's a mud cat you see at the bottom there. They have a very particular kind of spine at the side called a pectoral spine that's armed on both sides. And the bone on the right is called a basio-occipital. It's at the head, and it has cut marks on it where the head was being removed from the rest of the body. If you take the head of a flathead catfish, about 20% of the weight is in the head. There's excellent meat, cheek meat in there that can be eaten, and we find this at many sites. So lots of fish being taken, tasty. Next. A whole variety of birds are present at the site, and John Cordell at the OSA did the analysis of the bird bones, and I just simply plugged them in. Migratory waterfowl, both summer residents and migratory species that just come through in the spring and fall are present. Upland birds of various kinds, such as turkeys and grouse are present, wild turkey at the bottom, and a woodcock on the right. So these are a great variety at Wall Ridge. I think there's some 70 individual birds represented. And again, we don't do these things by ourselves. John Cordella, expert in bird identification, did the IDs. Crayfish were initially done by Steve Linsick. Small mammals I'll talk about briefly by Holmes Simpkin, and some of the reptile remains were done by the late Al Holman in Michigan. So it takes a village of specialists to identify some 125 taxa species that we have at Wall Ridge. Next, please. Eggshell, we know they're raiding nests occasionally. This is a pretty common late prehistoric thing. We found this in Oneota sites with abundant eggshell. So we did have some eggshell at this site preserved. Excellent preservation makes everything better. Next, please. Population stress, we have a mandible on the lower left. And I'm sorry, the photo is not wonderful, but this is of a 2-week-old deer fawn. And we believe it's probably a white-tailed deer. There's a modern 2-week-old fawn that was road killed above that. And you see what about a 2-week-old fawn looks like on the right. This would have been a spring harvest, a spring taking of this individual. And generally, we don't find these very young, large animals at archaeological sites. Have done a lot of these. And this is a very uncommon thing. And to me, this talks about resource stress. That if you're taking these large game species, but young of the year, that's not profitable in the long run. Next, please. And this is a scapula on the lower left or shoulder blade of an American elk. Dave Rapson, again, it takes a community of people to do this. We sent this to Dave Rapson in Wyoming, and he compared it against a whole series of large mammal, young individual scapulas, and he confirms that he believes that it is an elk scapula, and it would have been an animal that was only 2 or 3 weeks old when it was taken. And again, there's an elk, a young elk calf up above on the right. So again, maybe resource stress. We do have adult elk at the site. We have one other individual elk, an adult, and we have a total of 5 deer, probably all white-tailed deer, and at the site, and one of the 5 is that juvenile we talked about. Next slide, please. We know that they were hunting these animals. There is an embedded arrow point part in the cervical vertebrae and neck vertebrae of a white-tailed deer, and maybe have a little regrowth over it. So this deer was not only hunted once, but maybe more than once. And we've seen this occasionally in other situations. And again, this is when you're really doing a lot of pursuit of animals if they're getting hunted more than once. They keep after it till they get it. So game, I would say, may indicate a rather scarce resource being harvested. Next, please. Big question mark. I asked him to put a question mark on this. And this has been some debate among us, and especially above me, how important were bison at the site. And in the monograph, it says that we agree that bison was consumed on a regular part, consumed as a regular part of the diet. I don't doubt bison were consumed when they were available. How often they were available, just because you can harvest a bison, can kill a bison at 3 miles from your location, how much of that bison can you get home? If you read early historic accounts, wolves are coterminous with bison herds, and you have to pack out the meat right away. If you do that, you're leaving the bone behind. It's hard to tell. For me, it's hard for me to see how important bison were. Were they important? Perhaps. How important? I don't know. A lot of, I think, circumstantial evidence in the monograph about how important bison were based on other sites at Walridge per se. I just don't know. Deer and elk may have been just as important. Deboning offsite, bringing in what you can carry, can really cause the faunal assemblage to be biased based on bones alone. So anyway, I can answer more about that if anybody wants me to go into bison and deer hunting. I can talk a lot about how you hunt deer. Deer hunted communally historically by native peoples. As they hunted today, it's a very effective way to get white-tailed deer. And I think the hills or the Luss Hills would have been a place where one could hunt deer effectively of groups of people. And maybe bison weren't so common. I don't know. That's the end of my slides, I think.
Next slide. Okay. This is the summary slide, and Jim's already referred to this. We use several different means to estimate how long this lodge was occupied. That includes calculations based on the ceramic vessels, the numbers broken, discarded based on the population present. The population present at the site is based on the square footage of the lodge we showed you earlier. Food energy, get 4.8 years. Storage pits is another source of information. How much food could be stored in the pit, how many pits were open at one time, and what's available. That's 4 years. The average is 4.6. I thought it should be a little less, but the numbers are what they are, basically. The concern that Jim has, and sort of me in the same regard, is on this particular site, there is a lot of missing data. This is not like digging a site on the northern plains where the bison are close by and there are piles, I mean heaps, hundreds of bison bones. There's little doubt that they're taking bison as easily, as quickly as they can. Here, if they're going to get bison, they've got to go west 50 to 70 miles out on the Platte Valley, a trade, swap, barter, whatever, to get the scapula hose and other materials they need. So the data aren't on the site. And what you have to decide as an archaeologist is how much you want to emphasize what's there as opposed to what could be there. Last slide. So we get all this together, and here's the economy. Well, they're eating corn, they're killing mammals. Very little else was used. Amongst the mammals, 70% bison, less deer, less elk, almost no small animals. This pie could be cut different if you're on another Glenwood site that has more deer, less bison. It just gives you an idea. If you think back to that original slide I showed you of the site on the landscape and the availability of resources, what you've learned from these two scholars is all that stuff was close by, relatively easily attainable, can be divided into choose areas in terms of seasons, some more spring oriented, some summer, some fall. So you have a full cadre of adaptation to this site, which I think is pretty cool. The question is, how easy was it to live there? What do you do at the end of the winter when you're out of corn? When you're out of available meat before the fish start running? Well, ask the pioneers of Western Iowa what you did. You went hungry is what happened. So I think, next slide, I think that's it. Yes, that's
All
us.
right. Well, you guys did a great job. I think that was awesome. We have a few questions if you guys are up for it.
Sure.
If anybody wants to give them a round of applause on your Zoom, you can click the reaction, the clapping reaction or the heart to let them know how you feel. And I guess if any of the four of you want to jump in on these questions, I'm not sure who to direct them to. So the first question we have is from Iris, who asks, what is the reason for the concentric circles on the pipe bowls?
It's just a form of decoration. I'm not sure
Okay.
it has any purpose. The
Okay.
others are iconic. I mean, they do represent things like snakes and other activities, but I think that's just for Purdy in that case. So.
Okay. Someone named Bill has asked, why were lodges abandoned and new ones built instead of rebuilding them if they had deteriorated?
They did build a few rebuild on the same spot, but think about the resources they're using. How long would it take to exhaust all the resources in that site catchment area? Not very long. When the soil goes bad, their spring water source may disappear. Lots of stuff happens. Even with a small population in this little 9-mile stretch, it wouldn't take long before it turned into a deer sink. I mean, the animals are going to be hunted out. So they had to move around whether they wanted to or not, I guess would be. Anybody else?
To me.
Want to jump in there? Make them answer the questions.
You don't have to do them all, Joe.
Yeah, it makes sense from the point of view of the plant resources too. Especially, they need a lot of wood for fires and for burning and for tool making. The shorter distance you had to walk in order to get your wood. Joe pointed out how nicely how labor intensive it is to exploit some of these wood resources. So that was one of the reasons also to move, so that they were a little bit closer to the trees and the other plant resources that they needed. And their plots, their garden plots, their fields, they wanted to give a little time for the soil to replenish there as well.
Sure. I guess that kind of leads us into the next question we had from Leo, who was wondering, did you get a sense of where their agricultural fields were? Like, did they farm on a hillside or maybe in a flatter floodplain or valley?
Well, we think they probably hedge their bets by having fields in a couple of different places. There are some of these lodges that are in very small interior valleys, and a couple that are facing the Missouri River Valley. So they probably use those lowland settings, but they also used the slopes if they weren't too steep, and
Sure.
maybe even use some of the ridge tops as well, because for a few years they certainly could be very productive. And you didn't want to lose an entire crop due to a flood in one area or erosion in another area, or crop loss due to insects or fungus in one area. So they probably had several going simultaneously.
Okay. I'm sorry if I missed this, but I was just wondering, do we have any idea about how many individuals might be living in a lodge?
Depends on the size. This one, I think we calculated 15 people. So
Okay.
it's like a sister, two sisters, their husbands and children, and grandma, depending upon, we don't know what
Yeah.
the actual breakdown of the population was in each lodge, but it's wholly a function of the size of the lodge. And a lot of these lodges are smaller, so they're more like a nuclear family.
Okay.
They're living
Okay, another question is, are the eggshells identifiable like as to species? Somebody had written, there's some evidence that turkeys were being managed and fed maize at some Iroquois sites. Is it possible that the eggshells from Wall Ridge are from captive wild turkeys?
Oh, this is Jim. We don't think so, as far as we know. We have no evidence for it. There is a suggestion. We didn't get a complete analysis. We weren't able to get a complete analysis of the eggshell. I think it's perhaps from Canada goose or other kinds of nesting waterfowl. At least a couple of fragments of eggshell are tentatively identified as being from a trumpeter swan. So nests that you can raid down on you can go down and on the river or the edge of the river area, the Missouri River, and raid nests is probably where these shells were coming from.
Okay.
I have a feeling that they probably would not have wanted to raise turkeys and to use their corn to feed the turkeys deliberately. I mean, the turkeys were probably in the cornfields anyway. And I think they needed to conserve as much of their crop for their own use as possible.
Sure. I mean, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. They weren't producing great surpluses, I don't think.
Okay. All right. Well, I think that is it. And we thank you so much, the four of you. This was excellent. I just wanted to mention that we are celebrating the 175th anniversary of Iowa's statehood with a full slate of events, and we encourage you to visit our website for details, which is iowaculture.gov. And our next Iowa Story lecture is at noon on Thursday, August 12th, when Paul Jewell will lecture on Grant Wood and the 1930s artists at the Iowa State Fair. So thank you everybody for coming, and this will be recorded if you want to share it with your friends and family that couldn't be here today. I think that's all. So thank you so much.
Great.
Just want to echo Allison. Thank you very much, Mr. Green, Mr. Tiffany, Mr. Theler, and Mr. Perry. That was outstanding. We really appreciate the work you've done for many, many years now, as well as with your collaborators. Thanks again.